Well, good morning, everyone. We'll be speaking with Pierre Fitzgibbon this morning. He's the Minister of Economy, Innovation and Energy in Quebec. He'll be joining us virtually from the National Assembly of Quebec in Quebec City. Thank you for joining us, Pierre, this morning. Bonjour.
Morning.
A few data points before we start. Quebec's gross domestic product in 2022 was around 430 billion Canadian dollars. That's slightly more than half of the GDP of Ontario. The net debt to GDP ratio is down 15 basis points over the past 10 years to 38%. And your government, Pierre, has slashed the province growth forecast by half for 2024 to 0.7%, a little less than Canada at 0.9%. Pierre, credit agencies gave Quebec a better outlook in the past couple of years, upgrading the rating. How will you qualify Quebec's reputation on financial markets today compared to, let's say, 10 years ago?
Thank you, Mathieu. First of all, I apologize to my colleague, Mr. Finance, Girard, was supposed to be with you in person, but we're currently negotiating with the public civil servants, so that's why he's here with me. But to answer your question, I think the reputation is good. I think we, over the last 10 years, 27% of our debt was issued internationally, and Mr. Girard's objective is to maintain kind of a 20-30%. Yes, we reduced the GDP growth next year, but I think we've got a prudent management of our public finances. Obviously, we want to maintain all our state or critical missions, and we need to have some previsibility in the market. I think we've gone a long way, we'll get to that, I'm sure, later, about reducing the productivity gap with Ontario, for example, which is our marker. We've made some great progress, still work to be done. So between a prudent management of our financial resources and a dynamic growth pattern in our economic development, I think we can achieve the objective to be rigorous in our debt to GDP.
Since the pandemic, the debt service went from $8 billion to $10 billion. The net debt went from, will be in 2024 to $218 billion. That's up $46 billion since the pandemic. What room do you have left to increase Quebec's debt and continue investing?
Well, on the one hand, I think Mr. Girard stated publicly that he wants to maintain, he wants to aim for a 33% debt ratio by 2033 and get down to eventually 30%. And obviously, managing that through coming out of the crisis, coming out of the pandemic is a challenge. However, we did have significant growth in economic development over the last 2 years. Now it's obviously, we have a heated environment, but through not cost cutting, but through making sure that we don't increase our expenditure too much. And we're, as we speak, beginning our budget process for next year, and then we want to maintain our budgetary level, but reallocating funds in areas where we can create more economic growth. So I think we'll be able to manage through obviously higher increase out of the pandemic, but we want to keep our target at 33% by 2033.
For the Canadian government, coming back to a balanced budget doesn't seem so much like a priority. Is it one for the Quebec government?
Yeah, it is. I think in the last mise à jour, the economic update we published in December, actually in November, sorry, we are aiming at 2027, 2028 for a balanced budget. Of course, it's a challenge given where we're starting right now with the slowdown in the economy, but we need to keep that target, frankly, because it's so easy to give excuse that we'll postpone that. But in the meantime, of course, we'll be careful not to cut into social services. This is something that obviously is not negotiable. Whether it's health service, education, those are critical missions for the state, and we'll have to manage. I think all the ministry involved requiring budgetary increase realize that it's probably going to be difficult next couple of years because that target is important.
Pierre, I'm happy to have you on today because you are the Energy Minister, and Hydro-Quebec, which is the government-owned utility, is planning to expand in the next decade to invest about $100 billion by 2035 on new generation capacity, new transmission lines. Now that we've talked about that, how do you plan to fund this expansion? Because that's a huge amount of money.
Yeah, it is. And I think, obviously, glad you bring that up. Merging economy and energy made a lot of sense because obviously we have a focus to to fill the gap with Ontario, the US eventually on the productivity. So we need to create wealth in our different industrial kind of patterns or clusters, should I say. At the same time, we want to decarbonize. I mean, we're 99% green energy in Quebec sourcing. So we want to be basically increasing the Hydro-Quebec green energy capabilities to further speed our process to decarbonize, yet to also supply industries. The funding is 160 billion, I guess, in the next 10 years. Between Hydro-Quebec's ability, between the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, likely between the Quebec government to some extent as well, I think that looking at the profit of Hydro-Quebec, looking at the increment is large, but I think it's manageable. And so far, we have Michael Sabia now that heads the Hydro-Quebec, as you know, previously the Caisse de dépôt, previously Deputy Finance Minister in Ottawa. So we got the right person who can balance, so to speak, the issue of financing and the issue of controlling the growth that we need to propulse at Hydro-Quebec.
But don't you think that credit agencies could see that as a risk, and because that would increase the debt, the overall debt of Quebec?
Yeah, well, at the same time, I think as we decarbonize, which is the primary mission of Hydro-Quebec right now, we can decarbonize and creating wealth. I think Stéphane has mentioned that earlier. We're using that for the EV cluster strategy, mining. So all of these initiatives that are required to enhance our ability to supply green energy will be allocated to industrial concerns that will create wealth as well. So there will be return for those investments. I think this is what we have to prove the financial community.
For years, the Quebec government was coming in New York saying, we have surpluses of electricity. We have too much electricity to sell. And now like we're close to a shortage pretty much in Quebec, or a shortfall. What happened there? Was it poor planning, or?
No, I think we're victim of our success, frankly. As we go through the decarbonation pathway, how many places in the world that can supply low-cost green energy? Not that many places. So, I mean, to give you an indication, between 2000 and 2021, there was only one project in Quebec that required more than 50 megawatts. I've got over 50 on my desk. So we are a victim of that success where companies want to come in Quebec, whether it's produce green aluminum, whether it's produce green steel, whether it's produce cathode anode for the battery components. So we're faced with that so-called success. Now, of course, our issue now is to allocate those megawatts. So clearly there ain't going to be any problem with residential, consumer, with commercial, hospital, and school, for example. So obviously that's being taken care of in the next now forever. So now what I have to do with my team, because we now have energy and economy together, we need to have a filter to determine whom should get the energy. That filter is basically GHG reduction, economic wealth creation, and being socially acceptable, because that's obviously an issue as well. So that's going to be the filter we're going to use. So yes, we have kind of shortage right now. We cannot fulfill all the requirements, but you know what? I've been talking to companies, and the action plan that we Hydro-Quebec has presented a few weeks ago. A lot of companies saying, "Okay, we'll wait. We'd rather wait a year or two before we make a project because we want to access that renewable green energy, which will be solar, wind, and hydro to a large extent." So I think we're in a good position. But yes, there is a constraint. There is a tightness of the demand supply, but I think it's to the Quebecers' benefit.
When we started this conversation, you mentioned the wealth gap between Ontario and Quebec, and your government is quite, I would say, obsessed about it. Am I right?
Yeah.
In 2018, the wealth gap, so it's the real GDP per capita pretty much here. So in 2018, the wealth gap was 16%, 2022, 13.5%, 2026, the target is 10%. Why are you so concerned about the wealth gap?
Well, I think it's a marker. I mean, in politics, I realize, because I come from the private industry, if you don't have any marker and you just focus on generalities, nothing gets done. So when I came in position with the Premier Legault, we focus on the GDP per capita, which is not the only driver, by the way, but it's one which is easily measurable. So as we reduce the productivity gap, or as we increase the wealthness of the Canadians, of our Quebecers, I think it's going to ultimately create some wealth. Now, the drivers to get that done are primarily productivity. I think Mathieu has mentioned that, and we have a big focus on that, and we have a lot of programs at Investissement Quebec to help companies to digitalize and robotize and so forth. And we have also an issue with startups. So we're using that as a marker, but what's important is a driver underneath that will move the needle. And I think we're clearly working hard on innovation, working hard on the decarbonation, which we create wealth, and Éric Girard is putting some financial incentive into that, and you have a fiscal plan, which for the corporate with the tax credit, it's pretty relevant. So we have between myself and Éric Girard put the features together so we can move the needles and reduce it. And we, as you said, we were at 16% gap in Ontario, and now we're at 13. It's still a large gap, but the issue is not when you finalize to get to zero, it's the pathway to get there. And I think we've got certainly the motivation to continue to increase productivity, which is ultimately the driver of the wealth creation.
Quebecers are the most taxed people in North America. Any plans to reverse that?
We partially reduced it. We reduced the 1%, the different levels of taxation. I think we are highly taxed on the consumer side. At the same time, you have to look at the cost of living, and there's other social services paid by the state. So obviously, one has to be very careful looking only at tax rate. But we are cognizant that there's been a pressure on Quebecers to compare to the rest of Canada, and Mr. Girard has announced some pretty important reduction points. We want to aim at reducing that, but as you said earlier in the interview, at the same time, we want to make sure we maintain social services in Quebec, and we don't increase our debt per GDP. So there's a matrix there that we have to maneuver. So we have to be careful. I don't think there'll be short-term further reduction of taxation for individuals if we did it. We need to focus on our rigor in the financial management of our debt, but we have this balance to maintain because we want to be attractive for individuals and also attractive for corporations to do business here in Quebec.
Pierre, let's talk about your passion, EV battery plants. There's Northvolt, the Swedish manufacturer that will set up shop near Montreal with a $7 billion factory. Along with the Canadian government, the government of Quebec is investing in capital expansion about $1.4 billion and potentially up to $1.5 billion in operating expenses. My question is it the best use of Quebecers' money, or should we put this money in mining operations, for example, where we do have a real comparative advantage?
Well, I think a lot of people ask the question, are we putting too much effort into the battery file? Well, the battery file, call it the EV, electrification of transport. I look at our strategy, which is to get mining to battery materials, get the recycling done, because eventually we'll need urban mining, and also produce commercial EV vehicles. I think the reason we're excited about the battery is exactly what you just said. It's the first time ever in the history of Quebec that we're able to take a mineral, which is called lithium, nickel, or graphite in the case of the battery components, and get to the mining up to the value added to eventually sell at Northvolt, or to do cathode anode at GM POSCO and Ford EcoPro. It's the first time ever in the history of Quebec we're able to have a tight supply chain in an area. So the numbers, it's going to be about $15 billion invested in, so far we've announced. I think there's probably another 15 to come in the next 2 years. It'll be a $30 billion industry. We start from scratch, but that includes mining. And I think that the integration of the supply chain makes Quebecers will enrich themselves with the value creation pathway. And we have other areas as well. We're going to be we could be one of the first in the world to make green aluminum, because Alcoa and Rio Tinto have created this technology called ELYSIS out of Quebec, and we'll put some investment there as well. And there's potentially green steel because we have high purity iron in the Labrador and Quebec area. So, we need to diversify. Yes, it's a lot of money, but at the same time, just to conclude on that, the 15 billion that we've announced of projects so far, the portion which we call grant is about 800 million so far, so less than the 5%. So yes, and we have a lot of loans in there, and also we have some equity investment. So when you look at the makeup of the financial support, which is about 2.5, 3 billion out of 15, I think it's manageable. Only a portion of that is true grants. So I think we're seeding an industry that didn't exist. We used to make cars in Quebec. Those are my age. Remember, GM used to make Camaros in north of Quebec. But you know what? To me, making cars is not the issue now. I want to make sure that our critical minerals are converted to create a value-added chain in Quebec, which I think we're building right now.
There are a lot of young companies in there. Even Nordvolt actually is started in 2016, I think. How would you qualify the risk for the Quebec government? You said that there were a lot of loans, portion of equity. How would you qualify the risk for the government of Quebec?
Well, the risk is no. Will there be use for battery in 15 years? Because I mean, for most of the companies that come here in Quebec, the payback of our incentive is likely about 5 years. In the case of Nordvolt, it's 10 years. So therefore, will there be battery in 10 years? If the answer is no, then likely we will have just not created any value whatsoever. I don't think anybody here could sit down and say there won't be any battery. The question that people ask as well is that, what's the battery component, the material, the chemistry component of the battery? Will it be lithium-ion in 10 years? Maybe not, but you know what? Now, the Nordvolt, GM, POSCO, EcoPro, Ford, they're agnostic. And at one point, if we have a cell made out of the sodium phosphate, more nickel, less lithium, these companies will adjust. So I think the focus here, or not the focus, of the major risk, will there be battery in 10, 15 years? I think asking the question is answering the question.
Another topic at la mode these days, beside EV batteries, are semiconductors. Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau, Manuel Lopez Obrador, in January, they announced they were planning to create a hub in North America to reshore semiconductors. What role can Quebec play in there? Because there's IBM in Quebec, which is the largest packaging facility in North America. So what role can Quebec play in that initiative?
Yeah, we did announce what we call the innovation zone. We have one, of course, with the energy transition with the EV file we just spoke about. And the other one we have is quantum computing in Sherbrooke, where we work at IBM and other great companies' endeavors. But we have also our what we call Technum, which is our microelectronic innovation zone out of Bromo, which is north of south of Montreal, where IBM, Teledyne are present. And they have been working on semiconductor, taking the wafer and making a semiconductor on it for the last 10, 15 years. And given the Albany Alley, given that we have expertise there, given that IBM is focused also on enhancing their footprint in terms of that plant, and the expertise we build, because we have universities feeding as well some talent, I think we've got some attractiveness here for U.S. companies actually to come and work with us. And there's already a lot of discussion with some of the U.S. company involved with the CHIPS Act, which obviously is going to be a great lever for the U.S. And given that the U.S. and Quebec, our international trade, 75% is in the U.S., so obviously we are really close to the U.S. market. I think we hope to think that we also appreciated by the Americans, and we want to continue that relationship. So I think on the semiconductor, we could be a good complementary kind of footprint for the CHIPS Act being developed in the U.S. right now.
Are you willing to put as much money as you did in the EV battery supply chain for semiconductors?
Well, everything's relative, but I mean, in terms of incentive, I mean, we are a government that would like to intervene in areas where we think we can be a world champion. And I think on the EV side, I think, I'm going to talk about cathode anode, I think we could become the North American center of excellence. On semiconductor, of course, the U.S. will have predominantly the lion's share of the market, but you know what? There are areas where it can be very good. So if American company, other investors will come to Quebec, built on our talent base, built on our footprint, C2MI, that's the name of the organization. Yes, we'll be generous because semiconductor will be there for a long time, as I think battery will.
Last question: is the Economy Minister of Quebec concerned for 2024 in terms of forecasts we have?
Yeah, there's headwind, of course. My concern is that we have the Quebec economy is a small yet diversified economy. We have a lot of SMEs. SMEs are more vulnerable in tougher times. We did a good job during the pandemic with our programs. Now we have to be attentive to what's going on. I think it's going to be heated up. I think it's not a bad thing per se to have a balance between employees and employer. I think there's a re-equilibrium being done right now, but I need to stay focused on our SME because it could be tough for the next 12 to 18 months in terms of cost of doing business. That
was the Economy Minister of Innovation and Energy of Quebec. Thank you very much for joining us this morning from Quebec City.
My pleasure.